she turned to her husband and said, is this a cyclone or a tornado? And he said, honey, that's just our land blowing by.
It really was the wild frontier when we hit the basin.
These guys thought they were going to die when they were 18 years old. And so coming out here, risk was no big deal.
The potato has endured famines, sustained armies, built civilizations. It set a template for modern agriculture and shifted the balance of power in Europe. It is the one plant associated with imperishable hope. Like faith, its reward stretches into the world as a symbol of bounty unseen but dependable. Today, Washington State is home to some of the best potatoes in the world, thanks to a foundation built by committed forerunners. A century ago, farmers jeopardized their family's livelihood one spring at a time, one crop at a time, in the hopes of hitting it big each year.
But it wasn't easy. It wasn't an easy life to really go into.
If it wasn't for pride, you wouldn't do it. It's what you do, it's what you are, part of what you're about.
In the Skagit Valley of Washington, farmers gambled that below the water of the bogs, precious soil would create a garden paradise. In the central Washington basin, farmers risked everything they had on the chance of water coming from miles away to make the desert bloom.
It's a gamble. It's strictly a gambling occupation. Unless you got that in the back of your mind that this is a gamble, you're not going to survive as a farmer.
Each year, a gamble. Each year, a fresh hope to give their families the American dream. Washington's potatoes trace back to the earliest seagoing voyagers in the late 1700s. Just after the Revolutionary War, Britain, Spain, and the United States raced to lay claim to the Pacific Northwest. They explored various trade routes in the Pacific Ocean and searched for the fabled Northwest Passage. In 1792, while American Captain Robert Gray was exploring the mouth of the Columbia River, Captain Salvador Fidalgo established a military presence further north on behalf of Spain. Fidalgo built a fort at Nia Bay and planted a garden, including potatoes. The Spanish settlements on the islands did not last, but the potatoes did. Members of the nearby Makah tribe found the potatoes in the overgrown gardens and continued growing them.
Anybody that did a lot of labor, and almost everybody at that time had to do a lot of labor, would value potatoes as a source of energy. If you look at the Makah diet, for instance, it was almost all things that you would get from the ocean. So it was animals that they were harvesting. So potato that they grew in gardens and knew how to cook would be a very valuable thing.
In the early 1800s, both the West and the potato grew in popularity. President Jefferson had potatoes served in a new fashion as French fries at the White House, and Lewis and Clark's recent return from the West ignited a spark for fur traders and missionaries to move to the Pacific Northwest. They hoped to capture both fortunes and souls, but the Oregon Trail barely existed, and the voyage was long. Food was dismal along the way. When young Narcissa Whitman finally arrived at Hudson's Bay Company's Fort Vancouver with her husband Marcus, she was happy to enjoy some variety.
We entered the fort and were comfortably seated in cushioned armchairs. They were just eating breakfast as we rode up, and soon we were seated at the table and treated to fresh salmon, potatoes, tea, bread, and butter. What a variety, thought I. You cannot imagine what an appetite these rides in the mountains gives a person. Narcissa Whitman, September 1836.
We have to remember how active these people were. You could think of a family of 6 coming over, and every day you'd be looking for food for that family of 6. It's very easy to find yourself in circumstances that were life-threatening due to deprivation.
The potato would go on to feed natives, settlers, and soldiers as they moved into the area. They mostly ate them boiled and baked, an easy source of vitamins and nutrients. They didn't need to be ground into flour like wheat and other grains. Even Ulysses S. Grant grew potatoes while stationed at Fort Vancouver before returning to the east. During the gold rush, the San Francisco area received thousands of bushels of potatoes from western Washington to feed the bellies of the fortune seekers. At the same time, potatoes found themselves in the middle of controversy between the U.S. and Britain over the sovereignty of the San Juan Islands. The infamous Pig War between the two nations began after a British-owned pig ate an American farmer's potatoes. The Americans shot the pig, and the dispute escalated. After a decade of controversy, the conflict was resolved, and the U.S. laid claim to the San Juans. By the 1870s, America was rebuilding after the Civil War, and Eastern businessmen wanted a better way to get goods and people to the Pacific Northwest. Construction on the Northern Pacific Railroad began. Their goal, to connect the Great Lakes with the Northwest coast. The railroad's path roughly followed the trail of Lewis and Clark. It became some of the toughest rail line ever built, but it would prove to be a vital partner for potato farmers in Washington. While the railroads were laying down ties to the west, the Army Corps of Engineers was developing waterway strategies of the western rivers and surveying the desert of the Columbia River Basin, located in central Washington. Lieutenant Thomas Simons surveyed the upper Columbia Basin in 1882. Although he was not impressed, he saw a glimmer of hope.
It is a desert, pure and simple, an almost waterless, lifeless desert. A desolation where even the most hopeful can find nothing in its future prospects to cheer. With irrigation properly conducted, it is safe to say that every foot of land now classed as desert will be found as productive as the regions more favored by rain. Lieutenant Thomas Simons, 1882.
But no American Congress was willing to spend millions to bring water to the central Washington desert. While farmers struggled to solve the water problem in central Washington, farmers west of the Cascades had water problems of their own. In the late 1890s, homesteaders from northern Europe were moving into the bogs and beauty of the Skagit Valley.
I'm sure when they came down into the valley, it felt like home to them. It was wooded, it just had the feeling, you had the water, you had the just true feel of the old country. Plus, as they moved in, others moved in around them, and you would have the different colonies of, like you would have the Swedish colony, you'd have the German colony, you'd have the Norwegians, and they fed on each other, which helps greatly when you're trying to develop something.
Together, the early settlers tackled the wetlands and marshes of northwest Washington with true grit, determined to make the bogs suitable for farming.
One of the first things that they had to do here was create drainage and put up the dikes so they can farm it. And a lot of that was all done with brute strength and awkwardness.
If it wasn't for the dikes that those old timers put in, every tidal cycle we would have water clear this far up. And so they reclaimed this entire Skagit Valley. They dug ditches and drained the ground was the most important thing so that they could farm it.
In 1894, Jess H. Knutson, an immigrant from Denmark, set his sights on the Olympic Marsh. Like many farmers in the area, Jess and his wife Meta had the task of transforming a bay built with stumps and snags into a working farm.
When they came by train, it was so wet and boggy that they actually had to take their furniture and put it on rafts and float it to the bottom of the hill. And so after they got their family settled on the edge of the hill where it was dry, then they went to work on the farm, trying to dry the farm out, removed all the stumps by hand, dug drainage ditches in order to drain the soil off, and then started farming after several years of that kind of work.
In the late 1800s, the Skagit Valley and other western Washington counties were the only areas in the state that could grow a potato crop without irrigation water. Their crops yielded much-needed food for a new rush of people heading even further north. In 1897, the Klondike Gold Rush began, and Seattle became the premier outfitting center for those heading into the northern frontier. Miners bought supplies and food from Seattle markets. Once the miners made it to the Yukon, they needed vitamin C in their diets, so they traded their precious gold for potatoes. The vibrant agriculture scene and ability to trade with the world made Washington a new hub for trade and commerce. The massive move west was underway by 1900, and Congress passed the Reclamation Act, funding irrigation projects in the Yakima, Wenatchee, and Okanagan valleys. Supporters believed that irrigation and reclamation would encourage continuous settlement of the West and make the desert bloom.
Most of it is sagebrush, and you had the valley along the creek that was grass, because that's where all the sub and the water was. But up here in the drier part, well, if it had good sagebrush, it was farmable. And they sold certain parts of the ground to individuals, so that money would go for construction. And that allowed them to start building irrigation projects.
In the Yakima Valley, the water changed the atmosphere of farming. New crops were being produced. Potatoes were especially difficult, but a handful of Yakima Valley farmers grew them hoping for higher prices. Planting wasn't easy, and harvest was backbreaking.
It was all picked up by hand, put in a sack. You went through and lifted the potatoes, and then the people went through and put those, they had a sack that they had a potato belt. And they drug that sack and filled it, and then they stopped it, make another. And then those were picked up by hand and put on the wagon and taken to town.
Yakima was an early hub for potato farming on the east side of the Cascades. As the railroads were coming in, farmers loaded up the rail cars with their commodities to sell to America. In 1908, while talking to Yakima Valley farmers, Northern Pacific Railroad's dining car superintendent, Hazen Titus, learned that the farmers were having a hard time selling their incredibly large potatoes. They were thought to be too big to serve in gourmet restaurants. Titus bought as many of the giant potatoes as the farmers could grow, baked them, and served them with butter to the hungry diners heading west in his rail cars. The potatoes were such a hit with diners that they became the signature trademark of the railroad. Posters, signs, spoons, postcards, all bore the image of the potato, and the northern tracks were forever known as the route of the great big baked potato.
The dining car, get a great big baked potato.
Railroads were bringing people to the West like never before. By 1914, the state of Washington had more rail line than any other state west of the Mississippi.
Well, I don't think Quincy would be here if the railroad had not come through here, for one thing. There's just really nothing here to draw anybody. So it was because the railroad went through that allowed them to want to develop and sell off the land along the railroad and get people to settle here.
By that time, more irrigation projects were slowly making their way across central Washington. Construction of the Highline Canal Kittitas Irrigation Project began in 1926, and Ellensburg became a boom town for agriculture and opportunity. Eric Moe took a gamble that settling in the Kittitas Valley would pay off. A former ranch hand, Moe saved up his money to buy a farm. He planted potatoes, and like many others in the area, helped transform the Ellensburg region into a thriving agricultural hub. Moe's son, Joe, eventually earned the right to run the farm. He soon partnered with another potato grower, Maury Balcom, a man known for his brilliant marketing skills.
That's what they say. You know, he could sell anything to anybody. And that's what that attracted he and Joe Moe together. Because Joe was a farmer and Dad was a marketer, and Joe realized he had to have that marketing in order to really make the potato deal do what he wanted it to do. And they found each other and became partners, and they're like brothers.
That brotherhood became known as Balcom and Moe. Utilizing their unique skills, the men built one of the most successful potato farming companies in the Northwest. It expanded throughout central Washington and into other crops, but has stayed a family business with Kittitas roots. By the mid-1920s, Kittitas Valley potato farmers were irrigating their land and growing crops, putting it far ahead of the rest of the central and eastern portions of the state. People moved to the area from every part of the nation to farm in the Kittitas.
I know we lived in a tent right beside the field, and we'd move the tent from field to field as we harvested the potatoes.
For some, like Alan Floyd, the potato business has been in their blood for decades.
I was 5 years old shigging potatoes off of vines for my dad while he drug a sack between his legs and picked the potatoes off the ground. My dad got into potatoes just for necessity, to feed the family. His dad and brothers all picked potatoes and hauled potatoes with little single-tire trucks to the warehouses to be sorted. All there was in those days was fresh packed potatoes. There wasn't any processors. And so it was a pretty small scale operation.
Alan learned the business side of potatoes from his dad and other industry greats like Pete Tagaris. With only a third-grade education, Tagaris emigrated from Greece and settled near Prosser. Pete turned his humble beginnings into one of the largest agricultural empires in the Pacific Northwest. His potato processing business grew into one of the largest in the nation.
Pete was probably the most dynamic man that I've ever met in my life. He controlled a room when he walked through the door. He wasn't afraid to take a risk, but again, he pushed people hard, but when it came to helping, he was always there.
As the 1930s approached, most areas throughout Washington were in the middle of one of the worst droughts in history. Dry stream beds resulted in power shortages throughout the Pacific Northwest. Topsoil began blowing away. The Dust Bowl wasn't just happening in Oklahoma. It was happening in Washington.
The wind always blows here in the spring, and I was headed to Quincy one night, and I couldn't even see the ornament on my hood.
It was in everything because the houses weren't very well built. You'd feel it in your mouth and in your eyes, and it was, forget about housekeeping.
Imagine 500,000 acres and a 25-mile-an-hour wind coming up, and there's no trees or grass to hold anything in place. And so 2 days later, you'd have, 2 or 3 inches of sand in your house.
Billy Johnson came west here with her brand new husband from Ohio. And of course, this was in the 40s, and they were taking a bus rather than the train here. And they got to about Ritzville, and it was very dusty, so it must have been the wind was really whipping up. And she turned to her husband and said, is this a cyclone or a tornado? And he said, honey, that's just our land blowing by.
Farmers in much of central Washington used dry land farming practices. They hauled water for their cisterns. The farmers and public appealed to Congress to fund an irrigation project, but their cries could not shake any money from the government. The nation was in the middle of the Great Depression. Unemployment was above 20%. People needed jobs. People needed hope. Gone, too, was the way of old politics. In 1932, the American people put their fate in the hands of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His overwhelming presidential victory signaled a new way of thinking in the United States, and his election marked a new era for the farmers of Washington, for those present and for those yet to come.
Yes, the task can be helped by definite efforts to raise the values of agricultural products, and with this the power to purchase the output of our cities. It can be helped by preventing realistically the tragedy of the growing loss through foreclosure of our small homes and our farms.
Roosevelt enacted the New Deal, and jobs were the highest priority of the nation. In 1933, construction on the Grand Coulee Dam began. They meant to permanently dam the river in the same spot that glacial dams had millions of years ago.
Uncle Sam, he took the challenge in the year of 33 for the farmers and the workers and for all humanity. Now, river, you can ramble where the sun sets in the sea, but while you're rambling, river, you can do some work for me. Roll, Columbia, won't you roll, roll, roll? Roll, Columbia, won't you roll, roll, roll?
Initially, the focus of the dam was jobs and electricity. In 1934, FDR personally inspected the progress of the project and endorsed making it high enough to provide enough electricity to pump water to irrigate the Columbia Basin. Potato growing would soon open up beyond Ellensburg, Yakima, and western Washington, but it took time. The infrastructure of the Columbia Basin Project took a decade to build and deliver water to the farms of the region. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation installed more than 300 miles of canals from Quincy to the Tri-Cities area. It would forever simply be known as the Basin. It would stand for new beginnings, new hope, new life.
It really was the wild frontier when we hit the basin, but it was opportunities for many that needed to be.
The idea of water brought farmers from around the nation and beyond to central Washington, where land was as available as it was fertile. In the 1950s and 60s, men and women packed up their lives and moved to the desert of the Columbia Basin with the hope of making their own way on their own land. Hank Thompson was one of those men.
We were absolutely convinced, my sister and brother and I, that Daddy had taken us to hell because the towns, they were old towns, but the basin had opened up and changed them a lot. There wasn't really housing. You really did have to clear the sagebrush. You know, I don't even know what to say except that it was so hard and you just tackled, you just dove in and started clearing the land and making it work.
In the mid-1950s, water finally hit the towns throughout central Washington.
And it was pretty exciting because my dad and mom were excited that the water was finally going to hit, you know, their ground. And Daddy would kind of keep us posted on the stages because it had to fill the canal first and then the ditches. And then when he said it's coming is when we'd go stand in the ditch. And it was exciting. And I don't even know why, except that it was finally there.
Once the water came, Rella's father knew potatoes would provide for his family in more ways than one. Rella, her husband Ron, and brother Porky joined him in his vision.
He loved them. He would raise potatoes. Ron and Porky would get so upset with him because he just loved them. And he just liked growing potatoes. And he was a good grower. And he just raised them because he just loved them. He would tell Ron, you make money on something else. If we can't make money on potatoes, that's okay. We got to grow them anyway.
My degree was in business, and I'm looking at him like, what the hell does that mean?
Today, the next generation still grows potatoes in the tradition of Hank on a farm near the Snake River. It was Hank's vision to change the desert.
You looked at this, it was dry. There was one pheasant out here, and he was probably lost. It was so barren and nothing green, and I could understand once we brought the water out here what Hank saw. His first potato crop starting to turn green. It was just amazing what it did to the soil out here. It became green, and pretty soon this country will raise just about any crop you want to raise.
When water arrived in the basin, opportunity exploded for those looking for a fresh start. The water brought adventurers, gamblers, and farmers left with nothing after the dirty 30s. The federal government held land drawings for servicemen freshly home from World War II. Some had no background in farming, while others thrived in their new home. Nelson Cox's father was one of them.
Well, you know, when I was a kid, there was a lot of people that drew units, but not very many of them survived. A lot of them really didn't know how to farm, you know, and a lot of them might have known how to farm in a different area. This area was kind of unique to itself. You know, wonderful growing season and everything else, but you got to get the crop planted and get it to survive. And then you had to water it appropriately or you ruin your crop. And our yields are nowhere close to what they are nowadays.
The canals and ditches brought water, but the wind and dirt still blew. If your crop wasn't ruined by the wind and weather, you still had to get it sold. Some drove their potatoes to Seattle to sell direct to the urban masses. With processors and packing plants emerging throughout central Washington, the farmers had to stick to their guns to get a fair price. While the land was being tamed, marketing the crop was opening a new wild frontier.
You know, when I was younger, there was 30 or 40 growers right here in this area. Each small farm grew 15 to 50 acres, you know. Everybody had potatoes in their rotation. They had sugar beets, they had potatoes, and then they grew the wheat, and some of them grew hay and, you know, the different crops. But those were a few onions. That was kind of the mainstay. We had all these different fresh pack facilities so we could go different places fresh, and then we had lots of different processors. It used to be the scare in the shortages of marketing really made it fun when you went to sell. And the market could be a boom one day and a bust the next. I mean, you might turn down a great price and then get nothing, feed them to the cows.
It seemed like risky business to many. Risk or not, potatoes were taking off. Changes in the farming business were exploding. This new breed of potato farmer was taking the marketplace by storm. They were determined to provide for their families. Compared to other crop farmers, those in potatoes were willing to take big risks to make their farms productive and prosperous.
These guys were wild. And a lot of World War II veterans, and so these guys thought they were going to die when they were 18 years old. So coming out here, risk was no big deal. Just dive in with both feet and look out. They liked a good challenge. And when you think you shouldn't do anything, that's when they jump in with both feet. Wild bunch.
For some, it was a risk worth taking. Developers needed people willing to take a chance to settle in the Columbia Basin. In 1952, promoters of the basin created a Farm in a Day giveaway, advertising the new irrigation possibilities. Volunteers built an entire farm, including a home, furnishings, outbuildings, and newly planted crops in 24 hours. The recipient of the farm was Donald Dunn, a 30-year-old World War II veteran from Kansas, chosen through a Veterans of Foreign Wars search. Dunn had initial success on the farm, including his potato crops. In fact, Dunn presented General Dwight Eisenhower with a sack of potatoes from his first crop during Ike's campaign travels to Ephrata. But by 1955, Dunn was $60,000 in debt, and he sold the farm to pay it off. There were many more than Dunn that lost their bets in potato farming. Those who stayed and survived the challenges put down roots that would last generations.
All the growers that farm around this Quincy Valley, I mean, they all kind of have the same story. You know, they all came from somewhere else, and circumstance brought them here to Quincy, either with a young family or, you know, outside of the military after World War II, and broke out all this ground. It was just all sagebrush.
The Callaways are descendants of this new breed of farmer.
So the Callaway family came here in the early 50s. That's when the water was delivered. My husband's grandfather was farming in Oklahoma, and my husband's aunt and uncle, discharged from the Army, drew a parcel of ground right here where we're sitting today. And so my husband's grandfather came up to visit them and just saw the potential of the basin here. So he moved the entire family here in '51. There was no paved road to Quincy. From Spokane to here, it was sand. The people that came to farm this ground didn't even have a place to live. So there was a lot of tents, and a lot of folks, my father-in-law included, worked in town loading rail cars just to make enough money to get by so they could plant some crop in the spring.
As the 1960s raged on, Washington was becoming home to more than aviation. Times were changing, and American families were eating better than they ever had before. Now organized and full of ambition, Washington potato farmers were hitting the streets in a big way to sell their superior product. J.R. Simplot and his food empire were growing. Frozen French fries were in demand around the nation. Names like Scone and Connors, Balcom and Moe, Tagaris and Chef Reddy were taking over the processing and packing industry in the area.
We had the rapid increase in the fast food restaurant sector. We had the Burger Kings coming in. I can remember Wendy's was one of the first fast food chains that we got business with here in the Columbia Basin.
The high-quality Washington russet potatoes were rivaling their competitors further east. Washington potatoes were feeding thousands throughout the U.S. in both the fresh and processed markets. In 1967, J.R. Simplot and McDonald's CEO Ray Kroc formed a partnership that would keep the supply of French fries in America steady. Simplot promised to keep McDonald's supplied with the world's finest potatoes, and the two formed a special relationship that changed everything for Washington potato farmers.
J.R. Simplot brought Ray Kroc down to Simtag Farms and had me drive him around. And one of the things Jack had me do, he says, Allie, pull over in that circle, and I know you got a shovel in the back end of the rig there. He says, go over there and dig me some dirt. So I dug some dirt up, and I bring that shovel full of dirt over to him, and Ray's sitting up in the front seat, and Jack reaches down and he grabs a whole handful of that dirt and he reaches inside. He's got dirt going all over Ray. I mean, he's got dirt going every which way, and Ray tells him to get that dirt out of there, you know. And Jack said, you can't find finer dirt around. Look at that fine dirt. Well, maybe fine dirt, but Jack, don't put it all over my damn suit. You know, I mean, God, it was neat. It was just neat to see him like that. But he put the whole shovelful, ended up on his suit.
The relationship between Simplot and Kroc grew into one of the most successful partnerships in the U.S. The demand for French fries was growing, and the potato fields of Washington State continued to be a new home to those looking for an opportunity.
My name is Frank Martinez, and I grow potatoes. Well, as a kid, you know, I used to play around the fields with my mom and dad. Would go work in the fields, and they would leave us at the edge of the field in the car, and there we would wait until they finished their day. And that was the experience, you know, being out there in the edge of the fields.
Frank Martinez came to Washington from humble roots. The child of migrant workers, Frank learned early on that the fields of central Washington were grown with the labor of hard work and sweat.
When I quit school here in Warden at the age of 15, the Beatles came out with a song called Nowhere Man. And that song became kind of my life, you know. Nowhere, man, well, what am I gonna do from now on? And so I started working for Scone and Connors at the time as an irrigator, because my dad was working there. And I stayed for 25 years.
While working for a local farmer and local produce warehouse, Frank learned about potatoes, how to grow them, how to sell them, how to manage them. In 1981, he planted his first crop on rented land. It was the beginning of his own farm.
It was pretty tough. You know, nowadays, looking back, you know, when Juanito Juan was growing up and Marisol, I really didn't have all that much time to spend with them. And especially after I started growing potatoes on the side, because I would do all my own farming at night. You know, I would work during the day, then after 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, I would jump on a tractor and go do my potato thing on the side. I remember spending nights, I mean, like all night on the plow. getting the ground ready, disking, doing all those things that I had to do in my what was supposed to be my resting hours. And it was really, really hard.
Today, Frank operates his farm full-time and is teaching his son the business.
You know, when you can come down here and dig a potato this size, this is about a 12-ounce potato, that means that it's 70 to 80% done.
Not far away, the third generation is quick to get his hands dirty.
When I grow up, I'm gonna be a potato farmer. A good one.
Like who?
Like my grandpa.
So many Washington potato farmers like Frank started from humble beginnings.
World War II really changed our lives from being a farmer in Toppenish.
I ask Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
We were evacuated to Portland Assembly Center. We lived there for a couple of 2-3 weeks, maybe a month.
After time at Portland Assembly Center, Paul Hirai and his family took work on a farm in Oregon. A friend of Paul's had moved to Washington in 1952, and he continuously told Paul about the bounty of the Columbia Basin.
At least 3-4 times a year, he would come back down and visit us and tell us how easy it is to farm here in the Columbia Basin because of the sandy soil and the abundance of water. You know, there was no sprinklers yet at that time. He was telling us about the crop production was much, much better than Eastern Oregon and this type of thing. So then in 1960, he convinced me that I should move up here.
Even after moving north, Paul and his family still face challenges of taming the desert.
It was a tough life. Whenever the wind blew, if it happened in the spring, it would wipe out crops totally. It's a gamble. It's strictly a gambling occupation. Unless you got that in the back of your mind that this is a gamble, you're not going to survive as a farmer.
Today, many farmers try to eliminate as much risk as possible, but they can only do so much. There are factors outside their control that can wreak havoc on their crops and farmland. And while there's no silver bullet to manage Mother Nature's challenges, the farmers do have technology that can handle her effects better. Research has advanced in ways that improve soil health, water efficiency, and the crop itself. The recipe for growing the perfect potato is not an easy one.
What we have here is light soils. We have long days, cool nights, plenty of water. We have the longest growing season of anybody in the country. This is a potato planter. We plant 8 rows at a time. We open the dirt. As we open it, the seed falls. In my case, about every 12 inches. And then we've got the healing discs on the rear that cover the seed and make the mound. And we have to make a big mound because our potatoes in Washington State grow so nice and so big and so many that we have to have a big hill to keep them covered, because otherwise they'll be hit by the sun, and every potato that gets hit by the sun is basically no good.
This particular field, we're about halfway through the growing season. It's July, and it was planted back in late April. And so what we're doing right now is basically keeping the field really healthy and strong. And we do that by monitoring the water and the tissue on the leaves. And we do this every day. So it's not just like a once a week type of thing. As long as the plant is still growing, it's producing potatoes. Once the plant starts dying down, it's done producing potatoes and it starts bulking. So we're not quite ready to get to the bulking stage yet. That'll happen in August and September, and then we dig in October.
Since the 1950s, researchers have used traditional breeding practices to develop new varieties of potatoes that meet consumer demands and farmer desires.
That Clearwater is. It's a russet Burbank that doesn't get ugly. So when you're growing potatoes, you need to try and grow these. See, those are pretty. We're just in the size now, and all of these are going to size by the time we dig a month and a half from now. Those are going to be beautiful.
From planting in spring to harvest in the fall, growing the perfect potato is a challenge farmers take on each year. Consumers want perfection, and that's what the farmers strive to achieve.
So we're standing in the middle, or well, the edge of Circle 25. So this is a Ranger russet potato field. And as you can see, not the prettiest field right at the moment. That's because the field is ready for harvest. In fact, we're harvesting this field today. Now that potato right there is just darn near perfect. These are going to be French fry potatoes. The length is important, to have nice length to it and have that blocky look to it. So that's a great looking potato.
And in the Skagit Valley, where they specialize in red potatoes, perfection is just as important as it is in the Columbia Basin. So not all potatoes make the cut.
It can be a small blemish. This is a black spot on the white. This is a bruise, a little bit of a bump here. So it doesn't take very much, but this constitutes a cull because of that slight imperfection.
Although potatoes in the cull pile don't meet fresh pack standards, they're still usable and are turned into dehydrated potatoes.
Everything is about potatoes. Other things that we grow, if it doesn't work for potatoes, we don't do it. And so we grow potatoes 1 year out of 4. The year it's not in potatoes, we usually use grass as a rotational crop because it helps build up the tilth of the soil, and it also gets the potatoes out of the disease cycle.
It's kind of like raising a child. You have to check in with it every day. It needs something every day, whether it's potassium or nitrogen or water. A potato is constantly growing, and on a warm summer, it's growing very fast, and so it needs just real intensive management.
The advances in irrigation technology alone have changed the industry dramatically. Hand lines, siphon tubes, and reel irrigation were the first irrigation mechanisms.
On my right is the reel irrigation right here is what it is. It depends on how they set them up on a rotation. It can be a 7-day or 9-day rotation, the way they move the tubes and everything. But this is the way it started out in the basin. A lot of potatoes, and some of them are still raised underneath reel irrigation. And then you turn over here to my left, and this is the way 95% of the potatoes are raised today. They're raised underneath sprinklers. And sure made a difference.
Elie Charvet is a potato field man who's been in the industry for decades. He works with farmers to grow high-quality crops and has seen technology and irrigation change. This is a swing span. It's what you see in a lot of fields in the basin nowadays. A lot of circles, a lot of swing spans. You can control your water a lot better. It's made life a lot easier and better quality potatoes. The technology's a lot better. The planting equipment, the equipment for harvest, and how you grow the potatoes is changing all the time.
We've also gone from, very high pressure, large nozzles that took a lot of energy to the much smaller nozzles that were regulated. So we're not only using less water, but we're getting a better crop and using less energy to do that as well.
This particular farm right here, it used to take about 10 hours a day just to change the water on it. It was all reel irrigated. Now it's got one circle on it. Now they've got systems you can actually turn sprinklers off, turn them on.
Now we utilize what they call a drop nozzle system, and that minimizes the water. The water's actually closer to the ground, so it doesn't evaporate as much.
It's a lesson potato farmers have learned well. When you're risking everything you have on this year's crop, any advantage you can get in your back pocket is worth the gamble. Technology on potato farms is not cheap, but for many, it's a tool worth having.
So that's what you see here really, is the description of all of our center pivots. Gray is pivots that aren't working, blue is ones that are applying water.
So we can monitor to make sure that it's doing exactly what we've asked it to do. You can change anything you want, like if I want to change how fast the circle's actually running, right now it's running at 38%, I can bump that up to 50%, send that back out, and now it's moving faster than it would be.
Rob Mercer and his family farm along the Columbia River in some of the driest land in the state, the Horse Heaven Hills. In the early 1900s, the isolated hills were covered in grass.
Back in those days, you had dryland wheat, you had grass, you had sagebrush. I remember my dad talking about the fact that how remote it was out here. There was literally one single power line, and initially not even a phone line.
Like many of their neighbors, the Mercer family moved to the area and raised sheep. But Rob's grandfather dreamed of more than sheep and cattle. Too far south to be included in the Columbia Basin Project, the farmers in south central Washington had to find another way.
My grandfather was very interested in bringing irrigation to the Horse Heaven Hills. He got the idea of pumping from people that were already doing it off the Snake River, and then started here in the mid-60s to create that system, which was one of the first up in Horse Heaven Hills, and must have been quite an engineering feat because there wasn't a lot of experience. If you think about it, back in those days, there was absolutely no infrastructure out here to start with.
Today, like so many other potato growers, technology plus innovation is the driving force of the family farm.
My grandpa was really about creating opportunity and about progress and moving the ball forward. So if he were here today to see the project that he started that they were growing grass with and the pump systems that we have now and those technologies, he would be ecstatic because we have moved the system in such a great positive direction for not only everybody here, but for the community that we serve with the food products, making huge strides in improving that process.
Even with the newest technologies and research, the gamble is still high. Not long ago, Mother Nature dealt the farmers of Washington an unexpected hand.
Well, I thought I'd better hurry up and mow the lawn because it was going to rain. It was the strangest feeling because all of a sudden stars started to fall.
I was in church. This kid come out and he goes, "You ought to come out and look at these clouds. I think the mountain blew." And I go, "Mountain blew? I never heard nothing so stupid in my life." Pretty soon we hear, "Yeah, Mount St. Helens just blew. Started raining dirt."
I remember we were looking out the door, seeing this stuff rain down, and you're wondering what's going to happen. You didn't know if it was harmful. At that time, they were saying if you breathe it, you could ruin your lungs.
I had potatoes that was just probably 6 inches tall, and it just looked like a white Christmas. It just looked like snow all over.
Luckily, the potatoes were small at the time, so I remember out there in the dark trying to wash the ash from the plants.
Everybody was afraid it was going to ruin the crops. What had happened is for the next 3 years, we had the highest rainfall that we've ever had. It produced tremendous crops.
Phenomenal crop. Beautiful. You got this new dirt. We didn't require as much water. It kind of insulated the evaporation.
What we found out, and people from the Midwest don't understand this when they come out, is that our soil is made out of volcanic ash and basalt.
It's that volcanic soil that also gives the potato farmers of Washington one advantage compared to their neighbors. More potatoes are grown on 1 acre in Washington than anywhere in the world. In this case, Mother Nature's wrath led to an ace in the hole for potato farmers.
The first year, my dad borrowed $10,000 from the bank. The banker came out and asked him if my daddy if he could pay off. My dad said, "Hell no." So next year, we borrowed $70,000. And I thought to myself, how the hell are we ever going to pay that back?
A lot has changed in the potato business. markets have expanded, prices have risen, and they've fallen. New varieties have emerged, and consumers have become more selective. Washington potato farmers, forever willing to take on whatever challenge may arise, saw another opportunity.
The pricing, because it was up and down like that, it made it very difficult for growers to go out and plant a crop and hope maybe the price would be good or maybe it wouldn't be good. And it was basically done on the fresh market. So the processing industry, when it came in, they needed a consistent supply. So they would pre-contract potatoes because they knew they could process these things and put them in storage, and they also developed markets. And so it took the great price, low price system out of the market. It still goes up and down, but not nearly like it did.
The fun's when you get the highs and the lows, because everybody likes to ride it up, and then you brace yourself to go through the lows.
Not everyone remembers the roller coaster years with the same fondness.
I lived through parts of agriculture that Ron did not. And you bring different things from that. And that's why my job is to worry about money all the time. Ron and Porky have worked very, very hard for the success of it, but he doesn't know the hard times. And you learn a lot from the hard times.
I don't know if there was the best part. I guess a lot of people said the best part is when you sell out. I don't know, it's a pretty rough life. A lot of risk. Kind of stupid to risk everything every year, you know.
Potatoes are one of the most cultivated crops in the world. Competition increases the need for a high-quality product.
You have to have the best of the best. When you go to buy whatever you buy, you want the very best you can afford. And it's our job to put out the very best product we can grow. And that's what we do.
Most any one of these farmers, the number one thing they have is the pride in their crops. They're like our kids, and we're proud of them. There's nothing makes you prouder than a great crop. I might have a crop from 20 years ago I'm still bragging up because that was the one.
The business of making the best potatoes has evolved from sustenance to livelihood. The markets, too, have evolved from domestic to foreign shelves.
These potatoes will certainly go anywhere around the nation, and at least a portion of these potatoes will end up somewhere on the Pacific Rim, whether it's Japan or China or Korea. Obviously, being in the Northwest, we've got great access to those markets as well. So they're exported across the world, but hard to say exactly where they end up.
Processors here bring customers out to our fields. We really enjoy meeting the customers and knowing, you know, where our product is going. It might just be going up to Wenatchee, or it might be going, you know, into Singapore. It's pretty exciting when you can produce a product and your end user, you know, is that far away. So yeah, we take a lot of pride in what we do.
You have to know, first of all, know what you're doing. Because not anybody can grow potatoes. I mean, I can say that out loud, and everybody will back me up. Not just anybody can grow potatoes. It's a science.
Some have called it a gamble, this farming business. Others have taken on the challenge with steadfast sweat and grit.
I am doing something that contributes to the well-being of this world, and that's feeding the world.
The story of the Washington potato and its farmers has no doubt affected nearly every facet of the globe.
I really enjoy being part of the bigger picture, and when I'm here, I can see the bigger picture. I see the product from the beginning, and I see it all the way through to the very end when it's in the grocery store.
But most importantly, it's laid a solid foundation for generations to come. Beneath the soil rests the hope, the worry, the risk of opportunities taken and shared. Beneath the soil rests the gamble.